It started with a small favor on a day I was already exhausted. Between work, kids, and responsibilities, it didn't feel important enough to explain. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just simplifying the story. Then I realized I was doing that more often, choosing what my partner didn't need to know, telling myself it was for peace, for stability, until I had to face the truth. I wasn't just managing chaos anymore. I was controlling the truth at home. I'm a working mother in my 30s, raising my kids while holding everything else together. My days are full, schedules, responsibilities, bills, emotions that don't wait for permission. I've always seen myself as strong, reliable, and loyal, the kind of woman who carries weight without complaining. This isn't a story about me wanting attention or excitement. I didn't have time for that. I was focused on surviving, providing, and keeping my family steady. When the situation first came up, it felt easier to keep it simple than to open another conversation I didn't have energy for. At the time, I truly believed I was protecting my home, protecting my kids from tension, protecting my partner from unnecessary stress. But somewhere along the way, simplifying turned into filtering. Filtering turned into omission, and omission slowly became control. Now I'm left wondering whether my silence was an act of strength, or a line I crossed without admitting it to myself. If you're a woman who's ever had to carry more than one truth just to keep life moving, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you connect with real, honest Reddit-style stories about relationships, motherhood, and moral choices, consider subscribing and sharing this story. Before anything else, I was a mother. That's the part people usually don't see when they judge choices from the outside. They see the outcome, they don't see the weight that comes before it. My days started early and ended late. School lunches, backpacks by the door, work emails already piling up before I'd even had coffee. I learned to live in a constant state of alert, not anxious, just responsible. When you have children, you don't get the luxury of reacting slowly. You anticipate. You plan. You protect. That mindset followed me into every part of my life, including my relationship. I wasn't careless with the truth. I was careful with stability. The favor itself didn't feel important when it happened. It was small, practical, the kind of thing you say yes to when your brain is already juggling 100 other things. At the time, my priority wasn't transparency. It was getting through the day without adding another emotional burden to an already full household. I remember thinking, I'll explain it later if it even comes up. Not because I was hiding something, but because I didn't see it as something that needed explaining. That's how it always starts. When you're a working mother, you make decisions constantly. Some are big, most are small, and you don't have time to examine every one of them under a moral microscope. At home, I was the organizer, the emotional regulator, the one who noticed when the kids were off before they could even explain why, the one who smoothed things over when tensions rose, who made sure problems didn't spill into spaces they didn't belong. I took pride in that. So when I chose not to mention the favor right away, it felt consistent with who I was. Someone who knew when to absorb pressure so others didn't have to. What I didn't expect was how quickly that choice would blend into my routine. The next time the topic came close, I shortened the explanation. Not a lie. Just fewer details. I told myself I was being efficient, the same way I was with everything else in my life. Efficiency, after all, is survival when you're raising kids and working at the same time. But something subtle shifted. I noticed how easily I justified it, how natural it felt to decide what didn't need to be shared. Not because I thought my partner couldn't handle the truth, but because I believed I could handle carrying it. And for a while, I did. I was still present, still affectionate, still invested, still showing up for my family the way I always had. But internally, a new layer had formed. I started thinking ahead before conversations, not out of fear, but out of habit. The same habit that had kept our home calm during stressful seasons. The same habit that helped me shield my kids from adult worries they didn't need to carry. Only now, I was using it in a place where protection and honesty weren't so easily separated. There were moments when I looked at my children and felt absolutely certain I was doing the right thing. That peace in the home mattered more than complete transparency. That not every truth deserved airtime if it threatened stability. But there were also quiet moments, Late at night, when the house was finally still, where I questioned whether I had started applying the same logic too broadly. Motherhood had taught me how to absorb discomfort, how to sacrifice, how to carry things silently for the sake of others. The problem was realizing that I had begun to carry something that directly affected my relationship, and I hadn't given my partner a choice in that. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that there would be a better time, a calmer moment, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and without meaning to, I had crossed from protecting my family into controlling the narrative at home. Not out of selfishness, out of instinct. The same instinct that had made me strong. The same instinct that had kept everything running. And that's when the question I tried to avoid finally settled in my chest. Was I still being the strong woman my family relied on? Or had I quietly decided that strength meant choosing the truth for everyone else? What would you have done in my place? Being a mother had trained me to compartmentalize. You don't survive long with kids if you don't learn how to put emotions on hold when necessary. There are lunches to pack even when your heart is heavy, bills to pay even when your mind is elsewhere. You learn to function first and feel later. That skill had saved me many times, but it also made it dangerously easy to normalize silence. After the favor, life didn't slow down to give me space to reflect. If anything, it got louder. More deadlines, more school meetings, more late nights where I fell into bed already exhausted. So when conversations at home brushed near the truth, I didn't stop them dramatically. I redirected them. The same way I redirected tantrums before they escalated. The same way I softened hard topics so my kids wouldn't feel the weight of adult worries. It felt instinctive. I remember one evening in particular. Dinner was chaotic. Homework spread across the table. Someone complaining about vegetables. Another asking for help with a project due the next morning. My partner asked a casual question related to the favor. Nothing accusatory, nothing suspicious, just curiosity. I answered while wiping the counter, my voice steady, my words simple. I left out details I didn't think mattered. He nodded and moved on. The conversation ended there. At the time, I felt relief. And that should have been my first warning, because relief meant I had started associating silence with success. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I replayed the moment in my head, not with guilt, but with assessment. Did I say too much? Too little? Did anything sound off? That kind of self-monitoring was new for me in this relationship. I wasn't hiding out of fear of being caught. I was hiding out of habit, the habit of managing outcomes. Motherhood teaches you that outcomes matter, that sometimes how something is said is more important than what is said, that timing can be the difference between chaos and calm. I had spent years being the emotional anchor of my family, the one who absorbed stress so others didn't have to, the one who stayed composed when everything else felt overwhelming. So when I chose to keep the truth small, contained, and quiet, it felt like an extension of that role. What I didn't anticipate was how that role would slowly change my position in the relationship. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was deciding which version of events felt safest, deciding how much honesty the situation could handle, deciding, without asking, what my partner needed to know. And the more I did it, the more natural it felt. I told myself I wasn't lying, that I was just simplifying, that I was sparing him unnecessary worry when there were already enough responsibilities on our plates. Kids have a way of raising the stakes of everything, when your choices don't just affect you. Silence can feel like a form of protection rather than avoidance. I believed I was keeping our home steady, keeping the environment calm, keeping adult tension away from the spaces where my children laughed, played, and slept. But something subtle began to change inside me. I noticed how I became more aware of my words, not careful, but calculated. I started anticipating questions before they were asked, planning responses that were technically true but strategically incomplete. That realization unsettled me, because I had always prided myself on being straightforward. Strong, yes, but honest. Now I was someone who filtered reality. There were moments when I looked at my kids and felt a deep sense of justification. I told myself that peace in the home mattered more than full transparency, that not every truth deserved a seat at the table if it risked destabilizing everything else. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I wasn't on for anyone, doubt crept in. I wondered whether I was protecting my family, or just postponing a reckoning. whether silence was actually making things easier, or just teaching me how far I could stretch it. Motherhood had taught me resilience, but it had also taught me how easily strength can turn into control when you're used to carrying everything alone. And that's when a new fear surfaced. Not the fear of being discovered, but the fear of becoming someone who decided that honesty was optional, as long as intentions were good. If strength means holding everything together, was I allowed to decide which truths didn't belong in my own home? Do you think silence can start as protection and slowly turn into something else? What made everything more complicated was that, on the surface, nothing felt broken. Our home still functioned. The kids still laughed. Routines still held. From the outside, it looked like the kind of life people admire. Busy, yes, but grounded. And I took pride in that. As a mother, I measured my success by stability, by how little the chaos showed, by how protected my children felt, even when life demanded more than I had to give. That mindset had shaped me into someone who solved problems quietly, someone who absorbed pressure without letting it leak into the rest of the house. So, when the silence around the favor continued, I told myself it was proof that I had handled it well. Nothing had exploded. No one was hurt. Life went on. But internally, something shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I started noticing how often I was on guard in conversations with my partner. Not tense, just alert. The same alertness I had when one of my kids was close to melting down and I needed to redirect before it happened. Only now, I was redirecting truth. I would listen carefully, not just to what he said, but to where the conversation might go. And before it got there, I would gently steer it elsewhere. A joke, a distraction, a change of subject. It felt harmless in the moment. But over time, I realized how much mental energy it was costing me. I wasn't present the way I used to be. I was managing, and management is exhausting when it never turns off. There was a moment that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't rationalize away. We were sitting together, late at night, the house finally quiet. No kids calling for water. No alarms set for the next morning yet. Just one of those rare pauses where you can breathe. He started talking about how much he appreciated how strong I was, how reliable, how he knew he could count on me to keep things steady, no matter what. I smiled. I thanked him. But inside, something tightened, because strength, in that moment, didn't feel like honesty. It felt like endurance. I realized that he trusted me not just emotionally, but ethically. He trusted that I wouldn't decide things for him without including him. And that's when the guilt changed shape. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was quiet and precise, the kind that asks questions you can't dismiss easily. Had I earned that trust? Or had I taken advantage of it? I thought about how often motherhood had required me to make executive decisions. When kids are involved, you don't always ask. You act. You choose what they're ready to know. You filter information to protect their sense of safety. That approach made sense with children, but was I still applying it where it no longer belonged? I began to see how my role as a mother had slowly bled into my role as a partner. I wasn't just nurturing anymore. I was deciding which truths were too much, deciding when honesty could wait, deciding that my judgment was enough for both of us. And once that realization took root, I couldn't ignore how uncomfortable it felt. There were moments when I considered finally saying something. Not dramatically, just casually. Slipping it into conversation as if it had always been there. But every time I imagined it, I pictured the questions that would follow, the recalibration, the possibility that he would feel excluded from something that affected our shared reality. That thought stopped me every time, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust myself to justify my silence. I had crossed from omission into ownership. The truth no longer felt neutral. It felt like something I was actively holding. And holding something gives you power, whether you want it or not. The hardest part was admitting that I had started to rely on that power. Not consciously, not maliciously, but quietly. Because as long as I held the truth, I controlled the balance. I controlled the timing. I controlled the version of stability we lived in. Motherhood had taught me to carry heavy things without showing strain, but it hadn't taught me when to put them down. And now I was beginning to wonder whether the strength I prided myself on had become the very thing that was putting my relationship at risk. If strength comes from carrying everything alone, when does it cross the line into deciding too much for everyone else? Do you think being a strong woman can sometimes make honesty harder instead of easier? What I didn't realize at first was how much the silence had started shaping my emotional reflexes. I wasn't just filtering facts anymore. I was filtering myself. There were days when I felt proud of how well I was holding everything together. Work deadlines met, kids cared for, a home that still felt warm and functional despite the constant motion inside it. From the outside, it looked like strength. But internally, I noticed a growing distance between how I felt and what I expressed. I stopped sharing certain frustrations, not because they weren't real, but because I didn't want to open doors that might lead back to the truth I was avoiding. It was easier to carry things quietly than to risk a conversation that could spiral into something bigger. That pattern felt familiar. As a mother, I had learned early on that not every emotion needs to be processed out loud. Kids don't need to hear your fears. They need reassurance. They need steadiness. So, I had become excellent at emotional regulation, at choosing which feelings belonged in which spaces, at keeping adult complexities away from places meant for safety. The problem was realizing that I had started treating my partner like someone who needed the same kind of protection, and that thought didn't sit well with me. There was a moment that made this painfully clear. One of my kids was going through a difficult phase. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of emotional turbulence that comes with growing up. Big feelings, lots of questions, a need for reassurance. I remember sitting with them, listening carefully, choosing my words with intention, not lying, not minimizing, just translating reality into something they could handle. Afterward, I felt that familiar sense of quiet competence, the feeling of having done the right thing. But later that night, when I replayed the day in my head, it hit me how similar that interaction felt to the way I'd been managing the truth at home. I wasn't lying to my partner, but I was translating reality, deciding what version of it he was ready for. That realization unsettled me deeply, because partnership, unlike parenthood, is supposed to be built on equality, on shared access to reality, on trust that doesn't require one person to carry more weight than the other without consent. And yet, here I was, doing exactly that. I began noticing how I flinched internally whenever the topic came close to the favor. Not outwardly, I stayed calm, composed, but inside, my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening, a quick calculation, a choice about how to redirect. That constant self-monitoring was exhausting in a way I hadn't expected. Not because it was difficult, but because it was constant. There was no clear endpoint, no moment where I could say, "This is over now." The silence required maintenance, attention, energy, and that energy had to come from somewhere. I found myself snapping more easily over small things. Not at the kids, never at them, but internally. I felt less patient with myself, less forgiving. I realized that part of me resented the situation I had created, not the favor itself, but the responsibility of managing its implications alone. And that resentment scared me, because resentment doesn't stay contained, it leaks. I started questioning whether my partner noticed the shift, whether he sensed that I was slightly less open, slightly more guarded. He never accused me of anything, never pushed. That, somehow, made it worse, because it meant the silence was working. And that raised a different kind of fear. What if I got so used to controlling the narrative that honesty started feeling optional altogether? What if this wasn't just about one favor anymore, but about a pattern I was teaching myself? I had always believed that being a strong woman meant doing what needed to be done, even when it was uncomfortable. But now I was forced to ask myself a harder question. Was strength about carrying everything alone, or about trusting the people you love enough to carry it with you? That question followed me for days. In quiet moments, in busy ones, in the space between responsibilities, because the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that silence wasn't neutral anymore. It had become a choice. And choices, especially repeated ones, say more about who we are than the situations that force them. If you realize that silence is slowly changing how you show up in your own relationship, Does that make it something you're responsible for fixing? Or is it sometimes too late to undo what quiet choices have already shaped? What finally made the silence feel unbearable wasn't fear. It was responsibility. As a mother, responsibility had always been clear to me. You show up. You provide. You protect. You think ahead so your children don't have to. But responsibility inside a relationship felt different. It wasn't about shielding someone from discomfort. It was about sharing the weight of reality, even when that reality was complicated. And I realized I had been carrying a truth that wasn't meant to be carried alone. There were days when I caught myself watching my partner move through our life with a kind of certainty that I no longer had. He made plans confidently, spoke about the future without hesitation, talked about us, as if every part of the foundation was solid and shared. And that's when the guilt sharpened, because his confidence was built on an incomplete version of the truth. I started noticing how often decisions were being made, small ones at first, then bigger ones, without him knowing everything that might affect them. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately change the outcome, but enough to make me question whether I had the right to let those decisions stand unquestioned. There was one conversation that stayed with me longer than the others. We were discussing something practical: schedules, responsibilities, plans that involved the kids. He spoke openly, assuming alignment, assuming shared understanding, and I realized how deeply unfair that felt, not because he was wrong, but because I was the only one aware of the full context. That awareness changed how I saw myself in the relationship. I wasn't just a partner anymore. I was a gatekeeper. That word made me uncomfortable the moment it formed in my mind. Gatekeeper of information, gatekeeper of emotional consequences, gatekeeper of timing. I had decided, silently, when the truth would be allowed to exist, and that power, whether intentional or not, didn't feel earned. Motherhood had taught me how to make executive decisions when others couldn't. But my partner wasn't a child. He didn't need protecting from reality. That distinction finally became impossible to ignore. I started imagining what it would feel like to discover something years later. To realize that someone I trusted had known something important and chosen not to tell me. Not out of malice, but out of certainty that they knew better. That thought unsettled me deeply. Because intention doesn't erase impact, I noticed how my internal dialogue had shifted. I was no longer asking if I should tell him. I was asking when, and how much damage time had already done. I began to feel a quiet urgency. Not panic, not desperation, just the sense that the longer I waited, the less defensible my silence became. There were moments when I looked at my kids and felt a strange mix of clarity and doubt. I wanted to teach them integrity, honesty, the courage to face uncomfortable truths, and I wondered what example I was setting by choosing convenience over transparency. That question hit harder than any fear about my relationship, because motherhood doesn't just shape how you protect others. It shapes who you become when no one is watching. I realized that silence had allowed me to stay comfortable, but it had also quietly asked me to compromise something I valued deeply. And that trade-off was starting to feel too expensive. I wasn't ready to speak yet, but I was no longer comfortable pretending that silence was neutral. It had become a choice with consequences that extended beyond me, beyond even my relationship. It touched the kind of woman I wanted my children to see, and once I saw that connection, I couldn't unsee it. The question was no longer whether telling the truth would change things. It was whether I was willing to let my silence continue shaping a future that wasn't fully honest. If responsibility means being accountable not just for your actions, but for what you allow to continue, where does silence fit into that? Was I already responsible for the consequences of not speaking up? What made everything heavier wasn't the secret itself anymore. It was the awareness that I was living in two parallel versions of the same life. On the surface, I was still the woman everyone relied on, the mother who kept the house running, the professional who showed up on time and got things done, the partner who listened, supported, and stayed present. But underneath that, there was another version of me. The one constantly calculating. The one measuring conversations before they happened. The one quietly adjusting reality so nothing slipped out accidentally. That duality exhausted me. I realized how little space I had left to just be. Even moments that should have felt light carried an undercurrent of vigilance, not fear, responsibility. I began to notice how often I paused before answering simple questions. Questions that once felt harmless now carried weight, because they could lead somewhere I wasn't ready to go. And each pause reminded me that the silence was no longer passive. It required effort. One afternoon, something small happened that shifted everything inside me. One of my kids asked a question, an innocent one, the kind that comes out of nowhere. It wasn't related to the favor. It wasn't related to my partner. But it was about honesty. They asked me why adults sometimes say things that aren't completely true. I froze for a moment. Not because I didn't know how to answer, but because the question landed closer to home than I expected. I gave them a careful response. I explained that sometimes adults simplify things. Sometimes they wait for the right moment. Sometimes they try to protect others from worry. As I spoke, I realized how familiar those words sounded. They were the same justifications I had been using with myself. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation, not because of my child's question, but because of my answer. I wondered whether I believed it anymore. Motherhood had taught me the importance of integrity in small moments, the quiet ones, the ones that don't feel dramatic, but shape how values are passed down. And suddenly, the silence in my relationship felt connected to something much larger than I had allowed myself to admit. It wasn't just about my partner. It was about the kind of honesty I was modeling. I started questioning whether strength was really about carrying everything alone, or whether true strength was knowing when to invite someone else into the weight. There was a night shortly after when my partner thanked me for everything I did. Not in a performative way, just a simple acknowledgement. He told me he admired how I always seemed to keep things steady, no matter how much was on my plate. I smiled. I said thank you. But internally, I felt a crack, because I knew that steadiness was partially built on something he didn't know, and for the first time, that didn't feel like protection. It felt like distance. I realized how much I wanted relief, not relief from the relationship. Relief from carrying something alone. I imagined what it would feel like to finally let the truth exist between us. Not as a bomb, but as a shared reality. To no longer be the sole keeper of context. To stop managing outcomes and start trusting partnership. That image brought both comfort and fear. Comfort, because it meant honesty. Fear, because it meant losing control. And I had to admit something difficult. Control had started to feel safer than trust. That admission shook me. Because trust is supposed to be the foundation of everything I believed in. As a partner. As a mother. As a person. I began to understand that silence hadn't just protected me from conflict. It had protected me from vulnerability. And vulnerability, real vulnerability, requires giving up the ability to decide how someone else reacts. I stood at the edge of that realization for days. Not rushing. Not avoiding. Just sitting with it. Because once I admitted that silence was no longer about protection, I couldn't pretend it was harmless anymore. It had become a choice I was actively making, every single day. And that meant the responsibility for what came next was already mine. The only question left was whether I was willing to accept the consequences of honesty, or continue accepting the consequences of silence. If silence feels safer than honesty, does that mean it's protecting you, or revealing what you're most afraid to lose? Do you think there's a point where staying quiet becomes a betrayal of your own values? The closer I got to the decision, the more I realized how much silence had shaped the way I moved through the relationship. Not just emotionally, practically. I started hesitating in conversations about the future. Not openly. Not in a way that raised alarms. Just enough to slow things down. When my partner talked about plans, I found myself adding qualifiers. Let's see. Maybe later. We can talk about it. Those words came easily, but they didn't come from uncertainty about what I wanted. They came from knowing I didn't feel entitled to move forward without full honesty. That realization hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant my silence wasn't just protecting the present, it was quietly interfering with the future. There was one conversation that made this impossible to ignore. We were sitting together, discussing something that involved long-term commitment. Not a dramatic, emotional talk, just a practical one. The kind couples have when they're building something together. He spoke with confidence, with trust, with the assumption that we were standing on equal ground. And as I listened, I felt a deep sense of unfairness. Not toward him, toward myself. I was letting him make decisions with incomplete information, not because he didn't deserve the truth, but because I had decided, silently, that he didn't need it yet. That word, yet, had been my shield for years. Not now. Not the right time. Not when things are already stressful. Not while the kids need stability. But yet doesn't stay neutral forever. It accumulates weight. I began to see how my role as a mother had blurred my sense of boundaries. With children, you don't always offer the full truth immediately. You gauge readiness. You protect innocence. But my partner wasn't a child. And treating him like one, even unintentionally, felt deeply wrong. I caught myself wondering whether he noticed my hesitation, whether he sensed the resistance beneath my careful responses. If he felt the distance, even if he couldn't name it. He never accused me of anything, never demanded explanations. That trust should have been comforting. Instead, it made everything feel heavier, because it meant the silence was entirely my responsibility. One night, after the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I stood alone in the kitchen longer than necessary, just standing there, thinking. I realized how much I had built my identity around being the one who held things together. The strong one, the reliable one, the one who didn't let cracks show. Admitting the truth felt like admitting failure. Not failure as a partner, but failure as the woman who was supposed to keep everything stable, and that scared me more than conflict ever could. I asked myself whether strength was really about never letting things break, or about knowing when pretending nothing is wrong does more harm than good. That question lingered, because I could see both sides clearly now. If I spoke, I risked disrupting the life my kids depended on. The routines, the sense of safety. If I stayed silent, I risked building that same life on something incomplete, something I would always be managing instead of sharing. Neither option felt clean, and that's when I understood something painful but necessary. There was no version of this where I stayed comfortable. The silence had already taken that from me. All that was left was choosing which discomfort I was willing to live with. I thought about my children again, about the lessons I hoped they would carry into their own lives someday. I wanted them to believe that honesty matters, not just when it's easy, but when it's costly. That strength isn't about control, but about accountability, and I realized I couldn't teach that while doing the opposite. That night, I didn't speak yet. But for the first time, the decision felt real, not hypothetical, not distant. I knew that the next step, whatever it was, would change things. And I also knew that not choosing was no longer an option. If staying silent starts shaping the future more than the truth ever could, does it still count as protection? Do you think there's a point where delaying honesty becomes its own kind of betrayal? Once the decision stopped being theoretical, everything around me seemed sharper. I noticed sounds more clearly. The house at night. The soft breathing of my kids asleep. Hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary things that suddenly felt heavier, because I knew something in my life was about to change. I didn't wake up that morning determined to confess. I woke up aware that continuing the day as if nothing was wrong would require more effort than I had left. That was the moment I understood how tired I really was. Not physically, though that too, but emotionally. I had spent so long managing stability that I forgot what it felt like to simply exist inside it. Everything had become intentional, measured, filtered. As a mother, I was used to being tired for other people, used to putting my needs second, used to pushing through discomfort because someone else depended on me. But this exhaustion was different. It came from carrying a truth that didn't belong only to me. I watched my partner go through his morning routine, completely unaware of the storm forming quietly inside me. He talked about the day ahead, about responsibilities, about things that mattered, and I realized something painful. The longer I stayed silent, the more disconnected I felt from him. Not emotionally, but ethically. We were living the same life, but not the same reality. That gap had become impossible to ignore. I thought about all the reasons I had used to justify my silence, protecting peace, protecting the kids, avoiding unnecessary tension. They all sounded reasonable. They all still mattered. But now I could see the cost more clearly. Peace built on incomplete truth isn't neutral. It asks someone to live in a version of reality they didn't choose, and that realization reframed everything for me. I wasn't just choosing between silence and honesty. I was choosing between control and partnership. That distinction hit hard, because partnership means trusting someone with information that could change how they feel. It means accepting that you don't get to manage their reaction. It means letting go of the illusion that you can protect everyone from discomfort. As a mother, letting go of control felt unnatural. Control had kept my family safe. It had helped me survive difficult seasons. But this wasn't the same kind of control. This wasn't about safety. It was about power, even if I never wanted it. I found myself standing in the kitchen again, gripping the counter, replaying every version of the conversation in my head, not rehearsing words this time, just preparing myself for the reality that once spoken, the truth would no longer be mine alone. That was terrifying, because I knew I couldn't take it back. There was a moment when I almost decided to stay silent again, to postpone one more day, to tell myself I just needed more time to find the right moment. But then I imagined the future continuing the way it was, decisions being made, commitments deepening, trust growing on a foundation that wasn't fully shared. And that image felt heavier than any immediate discomfort. I realized how much I wanted relief. Not relief from consequences, but relief from carrying something alone. I wanted to stop being the sole keeper of context, to stop translating reality, to stop choosing for someone else. That desire didn't feel selfish. It felt honest, and for the first time, honesty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like alignment. I didn't speak right away, but something inside me shifted. I stopped asking myself if I should tell him. I started asking how to do it in a way that respected both of us. Not dramatic, not defensive, not framed to protect my image. Just real. That realization brought an unexpected calm. Not peace, but clarity. I understood then that courage doesn't always show up as confidence. Sometimes it shows up as willingness. Willingness to risk discomfort. Willingness to release control. Willingness to let someone else react honestly, even if that reaction hurts. That night, after the kids were asleep, I knew I was closer than I had ever been. Not to a perfect moment, but to a necessary one. And I also knew that once I crossed that line, there would be no going back to the version of stability I had carefully maintained. The question wasn't whether the truth would change things. It was whether I was ready to stop changing them silently myself. If letting go of control means risking the life you worked so hard to keep stable, is honesty still the stronger choice? What would you have done at this point? The moment didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived with inevitability. I realized that even without saying a word, I had already made a choice. The choice to live differently. The choice to stop pretending that silence was neutral. From that point on, everything felt exposed. Not outwardly, but internally. Every interaction felt like it was standing under a light I couldn't turn off. I noticed how carefully I listened to my partner now. Not because I was afraid, but because I was preparing. Preparing myself to finally let go of the version of reality I had been quietly controlling. There was something almost surreal about how normal life continued around me. The kids needed help with homework. Dinner had to be made. Work emails still came in. Responsibility doesn't pause for emotional turning points. That familiarity grounded me and challenged me. Because this wasn't a dramatic betrayal story. It wasn't about infidelity or obvious wrongdoing. It was about power, about control, about deciding, day after day, what another adult didn't get to know. And the more I thought about it, the clearer something became. If the truth really didn't matter, I wouldn't be struggling this much. I began asking myself a different question. Not what will happen if I tell him, but what kind of person will I be if I don't? That question stripped away all my justifications. I thought about my children again. Not in a sentimental way, but practically. I imagined them grown, facing difficult choices of their own. I imagined them justifying silence with good intentions, and I asked myself whether I would accept that explanation from them. The answer was uncomfortable. I wouldn't tell them that honesty is optional when it's inconvenient. I wouldn't teach them that strength means deciding for others instead of trusting them. And that realization made my silence feel heavier than ever. That night, my partner did something simple that broke me open. He asked me how I was doing. Not about logistics, not about the kids, not about plans, just me. I paused longer than usual before answering, not because I didn't know, but because I suddenly understood how long it had been since I'd answered that question honestly. I gave him a partial truth. I told him I was tired, overwhelmed. That much was real. But the part I didn't say, the part that sat between us like a quiet third presence, felt louder than ever. I realized then that silence had begun to erode something essential. Not trust, not love, transparency. And without transparency, even the strongest relationships start to feel misaligned. I didn't want that anymore. I wanted alignment, even if it came with discomfort, even if it forced hard conversations, even if it changed how we saw each other. I wanted to stop managing and start participating. The fear was still there. Of course it was. Fear doesn't disappear just because you understand it. But something else had grown stronger. Resolve. Not dramatic resolve. Not cinematic courage. Just a quiet certainty that continuing the way I had been was no longer an option. I didn't know exactly how I would say it. I didn't know what the immediate outcome would be. But I knew that the next step would finally involve him. Not just me. That realization brought an unexpected sense of relief, because it meant I was no longer alone with the truth. Even before speaking, I had stopped carrying it in isolation, and that changed everything. I went to bed that night, knowing the next day would matter, not because it would bring answers, but because it would finally bring honesty into the room. Whatever followed would be shared, and for the first time in years, that felt like the right place to stand. If you realize that silence has already changed the relationship, is honesty still a risk? Or is it the only way back to alignment? Do you think some truths only become urgent once they start shaping who we are? I didn't sit him down with a dramatic speech. I didn't wait for the perfect moment, because I finally understood there wasn't one. The kids were asleep. The house was quiet in that familiar way that only happens after a long day. Nothing about the setting felt special, and that was intentional. I told him because I couldn't carry it alone anymore. I didn't frame it as a mistake. I didn't frame it as protection. I told him what happened, how small it was at the beginning, and how long I had chosen to keep it to myself. I told him the hardest part too, the part that made my voice shake, that at some point, the silence stopped being about peace and started being about control. He didn't react the way I imagined. There was no explosion, no immediate anger. There was a long pause, the kind that forces you to sit with what you've just changed. He asked questions, not aggressively, but carefully. Not because he wanted to catch me in something, but because he was trying to understand where reality had shifted. And that's when it hit me. The favor itself wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing that for years, I had decided what he didn't need to know, while building a life together. He told me something I wasn't prepared for. He said the truth wasn't what scared him. It was the idea that I had carried it alone, believing he couldn't handle it. That sentence broke something open inside me, because I finally understood what I had taken away from him. Not safety, choice. We didn't resolve everything that night. There was no clean conclusion, no immediate reassurance that everything would be okay. But there was honesty, real, imperfect, uncomfortable honesty, and there was relief, not because the outcome was clear, but because the weight was finally shared. The days that followed weren't easy. Trust doesn't rebuild instantly, and strength doesn't mean pretending things didn't change. We had difficult conversations, awkward silences, moments where the past felt closer than it had before. But there was something new too. Alignment. For the first time in a long time, we were living in the same version of reality. As a mother, that mattered deeply to me, because I realized that the example I wanted to set for my children wasn't perfection. It was accountability. I wanted them to see that strength isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about facing them honestly. I don't know exactly where our relationship will end up. Some days feel hopeful. Some days feel fragile. But I do know this. Silence didn't make me strong. It made me tired. Honesty didn't fix everything, but it gave us the chance to move forward without pretending. And for the first time in years, I'm no longer carrying something alone, and no longer deciding the truth for everyone else. That feels like the kind of strength I want my children to recognize. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking, Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.